you for joining us today. My name is Rafa Shams. For those of you who don't know me, I am AEN's Director of Communications and Programming. I am pleased to welcome all of you to our webinar, From Edith Wharton to Kanye West, Exploring Anti-Semitic Tropes in American Culture and Their Impact on Campus Discourse. I don't have to tell anyone that this topic is sadly very timely. The Jews are trending on social media, and it's not because Hanukkah is coming up. Anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish wealth and power and control, distortions of Jewish history and identity, virulent demonization of Israel and its supporters that go beyond political criticism have all resurfaced, promoted by celebrities with tens of millions of followers. To help us assess these unsettling developments and their deep roots in American culture, we have with us two faculty experts, Sylvia Barack Fishman and AJ Nolte, who will discuss how these tropes are found in American literature and religion, respectively, how they impact contemporary American pop culture, and for our purposes in AEN, how they are reflected in on-campus discourses about Jewish identity and Israel. I want to share a little bit about our two presenters before we begin. Sylvia Barack Fishman is an emerita professor of contemporary Jewish life at Brandeis University. She is the author of 8 books and numerous articles focused on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, Israel diaspora relations, Jewish identity, and portrayals of Jews and Jewishness in fiction and film, among many other topics. She also edits the Hadassah Brandeis Institute series on gender and Jewish culture. AJ Nolte is an assistant professor in the Robertson School of Government at Regent University, where he teaches courses on international relations, religion and politics, American political thought, and the Middle East. He has previously taught at Messiah College, George Washington University, Catholic University, and National Defense University. Sylvia and AJ, thank you so much for presenting for us today. Before I turn it over to Sylvia, I would like to request that from the attendees that you hold your questions until the presentations are over. Then you can type them into the chat and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So Sylvia, I'd like to pass it on to you. Please go ahead.
So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the way culture actually is central to the preservation and spreading of anti-Semitic images and ideas. And what I'm focusing on is the idea of Jews as disgusting and repulsive when they are prosperous. I think that that image of the disgusting, repulsive, prosperous Jew has been virulent, certainly going back before Shylock, and it continues to be not only virulent today, but also central to a lot of the anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that we see going on right now. Next slide. One of the things, one of the things that we see if we look at cultural anti-Semitism is that the most bizarre, outlandish ideas you could imagine about Jews are often spread through cultural expressions. And because they are so bizarre and outlandish, they seem to capture people's imaginations. I'm bringing as an example the ideas of conspiracy theorist and anti-COVID vaccine activist David Icke, who says that the world is run by a global elite of Illuminati, that they are shape-shifting, blood-drinking, child-sacrificing, all of which tropes, are often applied to Jews historically. And they turn humanity into a slave race. According to Icke, many, but not all, of these evil reptilian people are Jewish, including the Rothschilds. You can see the Rothschilds just can't get a break. Next slide. It wouldn't matter if those ideas were out there and they didn't influence people, but they not only influence marginal people, they influence people who themselves influence a lot of other people, like novelist and poet Alice Walker. And she, Alice Walker, says about Icke, a lot of it is shocking, stunning, profound, magical, The people who make our lives, meaning the lives of Black people, hell, were the ones who control you and everything. And that's the Jews. So when we read about Alice Walker's anti-Zionism, we have to know that unfortunately, that is embedded in negative feelings and feelings which are based on pretty bizarre material that comes out of other cultural influences. Next slide. Now, as I said, we can look at historical, cultural influences. Think of medieval sermons about Jewish usury. I was very struck doing a graduate degree in English literature, reading heartbreaking ballads about Jewesses murdering Christian children for the purpose of getting their blood. We all know about the blood libels. Shylock himself seems to be humanized, but then is revealed to be monstrous because he lusts after harming Christians almost as much as he lusts after money. And a lot of these materials and other materials are preserved in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that Henry Ford reissued in 1927, which accused Jews of operating a global cabal using banks and communism and unions and gambling and jazz to undermine Christian morality and control the world. Next slide, please. One of the most shocking things for those of us who are in literature is how frequent these ugly tropes about Jews are woven into novels that really don't need those things. I mean, if you think about the way in which nudity on film used to be restricted to, does the film need this? It's hard to know why these novels need the anti-Semitic references and characters, but somehow many authors weave them in. Some of you may have seen the new version of Lady Chatterley's Lover. Fortunately, the anti-Semitism isn't in it. But if you read the novel, we read when Jesus refused the devil's money, he left the devil like a Jewish banker, which conveys the idea that Jews love money. It talks about a character as corrupt as any low-born Jew, craving for prostitution to the bitch goddess success. And there we have the idea that Jews will do anything to succeed, the idea that Jews have power because they crave power so much, the idea that Jews use money to control other people. And then, of course, in another novel, The Virgin and the Gypsy, this stereotypical picture of Jewish women and Jewish men. Next slide, please. One of the most painful novels to read for me was Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth, in which she has a heroine, Lily Bart, who wants to be upper class, but the fortune that she thought she was inheriting has disappeared. So Lily Bart is trying to stay upper class by finding a man who will love her and she can marry, and that way she won't have to degrade herself by finding a job. But Lily Bart is a heroine in this novel. There's a Jewish man who's interested in her, Mr. Rosedale, and he is interested in her because he thinks if he marries her, that will raise his social capital. As we read in The House of Mirth, Rosedale had his race's accuracy in the appraisal of values. Jews are people who appraise other people. Jews are people who use other people in a transactional way. Now, what's fascinating is that, of course, Lily Bart is doing exactly the same thing, but it's not ugly when she does it. It's only ugly when Rosedale, the Jew, does it. Next slide, please. We see ugly Jewish characters in The Great Gatsby. We have a character, Meyer Wolfsheim, who is modeled on the Jewish mobster Arnold Rothstein, a small flat-nosed Jew who wears as cufflinks the molars of a human being. We're not sure exactly whose molars there are and how he got them. Next slide, please. Perhaps one of the most stunning anti-Semites, high-level anti-Semites, is T.S. Eliot, who has a famous poem about a wealthy Jew who's traveling in Venice and falls into the water where he is partially devoured by the crabs. And there's a kind of gloating character in the poem that this Jew, who is now under the water lower than the wharf rats dive, and he is still expensive, rich, and strange. Fewer people know about the fact that Eliot, in his prose, felt that assimilated, free-thinking Jews were actually the most dangerous kind of Jews because they dilute and pollute the culture in which they live and pass for normal. Next slide, please. A little more in our time period, Roald Dahl's The Witches shows hook-nosed women who kidnap and murder innocent children. That, of course, for anyone who's familiar with those medieval ballads, we'll hear that echoing the danger of these seductive Jewesses. Next slide, please. Harry Potter, not in the novel, but certainly in the film. The goblins who run the bank not only have hook noses and seem to be erotically attracted to money, they have a Star of David on their bank floor, in case you didn't get the reference. Next slide, please. We see also images of dangerous Jews in political discourse on every side, on the right, on the left, and among white supremacists. We see Kyle Chapman, perhaps you saw him in the January 6th televised interrogations. He said, "We will confront Zionist criminals who wish to destroy our civilization. The West was built by the white race alone." So to white supremacists, Jews are not white. They're only white to people for whom whiteness is a bad thing. Next slide. Also, as well as white supremacists, we have Black activists who use many of the similar images and language when talking about Jews. Jews plan to extort America, to assume world domination, and the Rothschilds, of course, own all the banks. Next slide, please. One of the things that's fascinating is that white, non-Jewish people who have a lot of money resent Jews seeming to have money and power. So we have Elizabeth Bagley, who was nominated to be US ambassador to Brazil, a woman who has a fortune from her husband's inheritance of the Reynolds Tobacco Company. You might think she'd be a little embarrassed to say something like this, but no. She said there, when you talk about Jews, there's always the influence of the Jewish lobby. Why? Because there is major money involved. This is a very good example of the fact that power and money are only repulsive, dangerous, fearsome, something you should get control over when it's Jews who have it. When it's non-Jews who have it, it doesn't seem to be as lethal. Next slide, please. So widespread are these images that people from other areas of the world have absorbed many of the ideas of prosperous Jews, powerful prosperous Jews being dangerous. Actually, there is a version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that's been translated into Arabic, it's been translated into other languages. So these particular ideas get around, and the terrorist Malik Faisal Akram, who tried to take hostages and in Colleyville, Texas, not too long ago, made the statement that Jews control the banks and Jews control the government. It's the same ideas about how dangerous and repulsive prosperous, powerful Jews are. Next slide, please. There are many ways in which that hatred of the prosperous Jew morphs into other cultural expressions. We hear in many different political realms lies about the Rothschilds and George Soros. We also hear misogynistic Jap jokes, and make no mistake, this is the same kind of idea. Many of these so-called jokes are about Jewish wealth and Jewish power. We hear allusions by people, legislators, to Jews as people with Benjamins, again, money. We hear also from legislators allusions to Jews as the people behind the curtain who control the American establishment and other populations, which is, of course, an allusion to the Wizard of Oz, the deceitful wizard behind the curtain, controlling everyone. These are not compliments. Next slide, please. Now, on a higher level, intellectually, one might say, some of the rhetoric of Jews as privileged whites is really just another version of this hatred and repulsion towards prosperous Jews. If you, in Marxist fashion, divide all of society into oppressors and the oppressed, and you say that the oppressed, by their very nature, can't possibly be racist, and you also say, well, Jews are not a separate people, Jews are just a version of white people, then what happens is that Jews somehow in the rhetoric become the epitome of white repulsiveness, white power, people who oppress and exploit other people. And then those characteristics get transferred not only to the Jews in the United States, but also to Jews in Israel. Next slide, please. And if we look at the rhetoric that is used to describe Israel and Zionism, white colonialism. So they've done this reversion or reversal of actual fact in calling Jews in Israel white, because half the Jewish population of Israel are people of color, and many of them come from countries where they were oppressed by other people of color. So being a person of color, not of color, doesn't really have an influence on whether or not one is an oppressor, and one can be an oppressed person and be a racist as well. So, but by creating this binary and by denying Jewish history and Jewish peoplehood and putting Jews into the oppressor category, basically the last 150 years of modern Jewish history have been erased. Next slide, please. Okay, so this brings us so that you see the rationale behind the title of my presentation for this seminar, this brings us to Kanye West. And it's fascinating, having gone through this kind of very quick history of cultural spreading of lies about Jews as repulsive people with prosperity and power. You see that a lot of what Kanye West says is just another reworking of the same things. When he accused Sean Diddy Combs of being controlled by Jews, show the Jewish people that told you to call me that no one can threaten or influence me. Again, the idea that Jews use money to control other people. And as we know, in that famous dinner, which I know will be expanded upon shortly, Nick Fuentes, who came to dinner, has often said Jews have too much power in our society. Christians should have all the power, everyone else very little. Another fellow traveler of theirs, Milo Yiannopoulos, said, "We're done putting Jewish interests first." I think it's helpful to understand that the lies about Jews, which comprise anti-Semitism, are very often long threads that keep getting reworked generation after generation. And that what might seem like fresh new insights on what comprises Jewishness is simply another version of what anti-Semitism has always been, the world's oldest racist lie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for tying together, as you said, these very complex threads and creating this narrative of different groups, disparate groups, from white supremacists to Black activists to campus ideologues, who all seem to share these a commitment to these tropes. So now I want to turn it over to AJ, who will explore the religious roots of this sort of discourse.
Thanks, Rafa, and thanks, Dr. Fishman, for that excellent presentation. Some of this will tie in directly. I'm coming at this from a little bit of a different perspective, looking at some of the religious roots. So I'll give you guys just two sort of upfront, perspective notes on my perspective. One, I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who studies religion and politics as a comparativist. And then two, and this will come out as well, I am from Regent University, which is a largely Christian university with, I would say, very strong pro-Israel and Christian Zionist DNA. And so there's going to be some theological response that is kind of what I would say a little bit of inside baseball on the Christian side, but I hope that is useful in contextualizing some of this. So I guess I might have titled my presentation, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? I think everybody catches the reference, and we've heard it a lot recently. Of course, there's a very famous dinner, now infamous dinner, right before Thanksgiving between former President Trump, Nick Fuentes, and Kanye West. But if you think about it for a second, Nick Fuentes and Kanye West being at the table with each other are somewhat strange. Nick Fuentes is an avowed white nationalist, an avowed supporter of segregation, a person who has essentially said that America should be, in his words, quote, a white Christian country. We'll come back to that. Kanye West doesn't necessarily seem like somebody who would be sort of an ideal person to communicate that message. And so what's going on here? And why do we have this sort of strange convergence of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic tropes from Kanye and what we're seeing from Nick Fuentes? What I would say is that both of these, from a religious perspective, have roots in either fringe religious ideologies, or what we might call, from a religious perspective, sort of philo-Semitism gone bad. And that there is also an interesting and troubling subtext, particularly on the Fuentes side, that I want to bring out, about Christianity as cultural identifier versus Christianity as lived faith. And I'll get into some of the dynamics of that and some of the social science of that as well as we move on. I want to start with on what I would call the Kanye side. So where are the roots historically of this anti-Semitism that you sometimes see in prominent ways in the Black community? And what are the religious roots? This is a story that is important and is also in many ways a tragic story, because that is not, in fact, how Black religiosity starts out. So as a general rule, if you were comparing American Christianity to its European counterparts and its origins, there is less anti-Semitism in American Christianity, because there is more of an emphasis on the Old Testament as sort of positive and normative and having value for Christians today. And this goes back to a lot of the Calvinists and other forms of the Reformation of really focusing on reading the Old Testament in its plain sense. And it also comes back to an ideology in American religiosity called Hebrew republicanism. This saw the Old Testament kingdom of Israel as sort of an ideal, but then they went back and said, actually, the kingship was sort of subpar in a sense. Really, what was awesome was the time of the judges. As somebody who's read a lot of Judges, I'm sort of wondering why they thought it was so great, but because it was direct rule of God, this creates the idea that the ancient Hebrew, as they called it, government was a republic. Hebrew republicanism's influence on the American founding is hard to underestimate. And so it is this positive conception of the Jews in ancient Israel that actually plays a major role in the American founding. So there's a lot of what I would describe as generically sort of philo-Semitic DNA in American Christianity. In fact, I would highly recommend, if you haven't read it, reading Michael Oren's book, Power, Faith, and Fantasy, which is a history of the US and the Middle East. And he talks about how some of the first quote unquote Zionist movements, I say quote unquote because this is not Theodor Herzl's Zionism, but some of the first movements that are sort of Zionist in nature are actually American missionaries going to the Middle East who have an idea that there should be a Jewish state that is refounded in what is then Ottoman Palestine. And so there's this deep DNA and this deep interest and engagement with Jews in the Old Testament and American religiosity. This is just as true in African-American religiosity. The most formative story and experience in African-American Christianity, as the late great historian of African-American religiosity, Albert Rabateau, makes clear, is the identification of Exodus as a story that gives meaning and identity and sort of shape to the Black experience. And I would recommend, he's got a number of books on the subject, but a really good one is his book called Canaan Land, where he talks about just how prominent and how important this Exodus narrative and this Exodus understanding is for African Americans. It is the story of Exodus and the story of the Jews being liberated from slavery in Egypt that really gives meaning and shape to the African American religious tradition under slavery and then beyond. And what is unfortunate is, as we see the roots of the religious roots of anti-Semitism in the African American experience, is when this sort of identification goes wrong and takes a turn into what I would call a pseudo-historical ideology of replacement. I don't want to get too much into the weeds and sort of replacement theology because it's a very broad term, and it's something that is a lot of, again, Christian inside baseball. A lot of people where I work here talk about it. I can discuss it more and some of the different permutations of it in the Q&A if people are really interested. I'm always happy to get into the theological weeds. But what you see with the Black Hebrew Israelites who emerge in the 1890s is not so much the idea that the church is the new Israel, which is sort of your generic and is often associated with replacement theology, but is a more explicit claim that, in fact, the true descendants of the Israelites are the Africans. things were not going well in the 1890s for the African-American religious experience. The promise of Reconstruction had faded to the sort of horror of Jim Crow. And so it's kind of a nadir in terms of the Black religious experience. And so there's a lot of different Pan-African ideas and looking to Africa and African history as sort of important for African-American consciousness. And so the Black Hebrew Israelites pick up on this sort of pseudo-historical idea that they are the true descendants of the people of Israel. And that's where they start. But where do you get sort of the crazily anti-Semitic tropes that you see from later on? Well, first of all, the minute you've made that move from we identify with the Jews and the Jews' story to we are the true Jews, you're opening yourself up to anti-Semitic ideas. But from what I can tell, and I've talked to a couple of people who are actual experts in this, I'm just, playing one on this webinar, but from actual really good historians of the African-American experience and African-American religiosity, there's a weird cross-pollination that happens, as we often see with fringe movements, between the Black Hebrew Israelites and the Nation of Islam. The story of the Nation of Islam's origins is not to put too fine a point on it, really strange. It is founded by a man named Wallace Fard, who is a mystery wrapped in an enigma, wrapped in a puzzle box. I don't want to get too down that rabbit hole because we could be there all day. But he is a very, very weird figure, a very enigmatic figure. We don't know that much about him. His movement, of course, is picked up on by Elijah Muhammad. And there is this idea of sort of white people as a creation of, the devil to sort of entrap people, and sort of Black people are the true Muslims. The Nation of Islam at this point is in no way, shape, or form actually Muslim. And this is something that's widely recognized by a lot of Islamic authorities. And then, of course, you have something that I'm glad Dr. Fishman mentioned earlier, the question of Jews and Judaism and whiteness. One of the things that's really important to keep in mind as you're looking at Black anti-Semitism and sort of Black perceptions in general is that in the mind of African Americans, Jews are almost always conceived of as white and as part of sort of the broader white community. And so that comes into play. Why does the Nation of Islam go so anti-Semitic so fast? Well, because they regard them as sort of another group of white people. I will skip over some of the discussion of post-colonialism and sort of the post-colonial ideology and how that intersects, if you will pardon the pun, with some of the idea of sort of the Jews as an especially malevolent group of white people that you see from the Nation of Islam. One further note on the Nation of Islam: after Elijah Muhammad's death, the movement splits. His son actually takes the vast majority of them and turns and sort of moves them into normal Islam. And they're kind of an interesting movement within Islam now, but they're much more sort of mainstream within sort of global Islam. Louis Farrakhan starts the new Nation of Islam as a separate movement. And for those who have not been tracking the various different religious odyssey of that new Nation of Islam, my understanding is that they are now part of the Church of Scientology. So the convergence of various different religious movements that we might describe as on the fringes of the American experience continues in some odd ways. In terms of the impact on popular culture and campus culture, I would say there's two. One is that a lot of these anti-Semitic ideas and tropes have gotten into sort of more mainstream by some of these celebrities who were influenced by the Black Hebrew Israelites, or influenced by the Nation of Islam, some directly, some knowingly, many more, I think, unknowingly, as this is just sort of an idea that gets into the air. But I would also say that the more elite sort of highbrow anti-Semitism of the left has also been shaped by this discourse. And again, it's because as Dr. Fishman mentioned, you have the identification of the Jews as sort of part of the white oppressor class in the intersectional hierarchy. And she talked about why that is a very bizarre idea. So I won't belabor that point, but just to say that I think on campus culture, that's probably a lot more influential. I will tell you that I talked to a number of friends who are more in the literature on sort of the African-American stuff and asked them, what impact do you think Kanye and all of the stuff that he's saying is going to have on African-American culture, or sort of more broadly? And the response is none. He's crazy. And that was sort of a universal. It didn't matter what strata from society I was talking to people about. So I don't know that Kanye is going to have that much of an impact. I think he is himself more of a symptom rather than a cause. Now, let me speak for a minute on Nick Fuentes. I know I'll try to be brief because I know we've got, we want to leave time for questions. What animates Fuentes and his particular brand of white nationalists is this idea of the Great Replacement. And this puts on my political science hat. This is one of the strangest conspiracies that I have seen, just in terms of the motivation for it doesn't seem to make sense. Their idea is that wealthy Jews are encouraging mass immigration to replace white people in America. So there's a demographic anxiety there, but they're looking at the Jews as sort of masterminding this whole thing. So if you remember in Charlottesville, there's this chant, the Jews will not replace us. That's not because they're worried about the Jews sort of in a direct replacement sense, but that they're sort of bringing in these people who are going to replace white people. This is a very strange conspiracy theory. And I can talk about why it's weird and doesn't make sense later on if you need it. I figure for this audience, probably there's not much debunking because you probably all know why it's a little bit silly and doesn't make sense. What I want to talk about a little bit more is Nick Fuentes' use of white Christian as his identifier and why this is actually a little bit concerning. First of all, it's concerning for me as a Christian because anytime somebody likes to qualify their Christianity and put another word in front of Christian in their definition, I find that that other word tends to be a lot more important than the Christian, and that those people tend to read their Christianity through the other thing rather than reading the other thing through their Christianity. So when I hear Fuentes talk about white Christianity, I'm suspecting that he is then using Christianity as a proxy for his definition of whiteness, rather than allowing Christianity to be the thing that's actually the most important. And I would say there are a couple of reasons why, as a white supremacist, Fuentes might make this move from a tactical perspective. One is that it allows him to write Jews out of the white story. So we talked about how for the intersectional left, the Jews are white. This would allow Fuentes to essentially say that the Jews are not white, and so he can sort of put them out of the group that he is then trying to privilege. The other thing is that Christianity allows him to draw on one of the older anti-Semitic tropes of the idea of sort of the Jews killing Jesus. Now, this is a problematic trope from a Christian perspective for a number of reasons. Of course, externally, it's a trope because it has led to a variety of really noxious forms of Christian anti-Semitism in the past. But it's also a problem from a Christian theological perspective for two reasons. One, Christians affirm that Jesus Christ was a real historical person who was Jewish. So to take anti-Semitism in that sense is actually to sort of de-Judaize Christ, which is a problem for us because we think the incarnation and the historical reality of Christ is important. And so it weakens that belief. Second, because Christians believe that Jesus Christ died for the sins of the world. It's pretty explicit in most of our creeds and the New Testament and so on and so forth. And so if you're assigning some other cause to why Jesus had to die other than for our sins, in other words, if you're making it a specific group, rather than sin in general, that is the cause for that. That causes issues for your theology of salvation as a Christian. So I would see this as a very theologically problematic idea. But what's interesting is that there is pretty good social science evidence that some of these identifications of Christianity with white supremacy come from those who are identifying as culturally Christian, but not necessarily engaging in a lot of religious practice. So, for example, there's been a lot of studies done correlating socially conservative ideas with a number of different ideas that don't have as much to do with social conservatism per se. And one of them that people found is, well, there's a correlation between some of these socially conservative ideas and opposition to immigrants and immigration and ideas of racial supremacy. But if you then sort of take that and drill down and say, okay, but these people that have these socially conservative ideas, are they active and active participants in their religious communities? Those who are considerably less correlated with those attitudes of hostility toward immigrants and racial hostility and so on and so forth. And so if we're looking at those as proxies for some of Fuentes' ideas about great replacement, then it is the people who are using Christianity as a cultural identifier rather than those for whom it is a living and active faith and part of their lives who are the most susceptible to these arguments. I would say this is particularly dangerous because those who are not, in fact, engaging in, sort of the life of faith, as we would say from a Christian perspective, those who are not active in Christians, probably don't actually know that much about what Christianity is about. So they would be much more likely to buy into what Fuentes is selling simply because they identify as Christians culturally, but they don't actually know that much about it. They don't actually know that much about Christian theology. And so they would be more susceptible to ideas. And there aren't people around them who might put the brakes on this and say, hold on, this is not actually consistent with what, Christians, particularly Christians in the United States, believe. On this side, is there a threat on the campus? I would say yes. And the threat is this. On the campus right, there is a tendency to try to prefer provocation, right? To be provocative. This is because campus conservatives tend to have an idea of themselves as the insurgents, as people who are sort of rebelling against what they consider the politically correct culture on campus. And so if these ideas are considered, particularly outre or particularly provocative, what you are seeing is a lot of campus conservatives are wanting to bring these ideas out for their shock value. And that is unfortunately giving a certain amount of shelter on the right to anti-Semitism. Evangelical Christians in the United States are one of the most pro-Israel groups out there, and they have very little time for a lot of this anti-Israel stuff. Unfortunately, one of the concerns that I have is something that was reflected in the dinner that Donald Trump had with Kanye West and Nick Fuentes. When he was asked about Fuentes being at the dinner, President Trump said, "I didn't know who was coming to dinner." One of my concerns that I would see on the right is, and what I would ask my fellow Christians, and I work at a university that's associated with Christian conservatism, do we know who's coming to dinner? In other words, are we vetting these people and making sure that they're not trying to bring these ideas in the back door? And so that would be my concern. How are we doing on time? I could stop here. I also have sort of a couple of concluding remarks on how to respond, but we could also save those for Q&A if we're tight on time.
I think, there's about 15 minutes left, and, we can obviously stay over for a couple of minutes, whoever wants to stay on, and depending on the schedules of you and Sylvia. But I think, why don't we allow people to start typing in their questions to the chat. And in the meantime, if you want to include your concluding remarks, that would be great.
Sure. So I'll go over these quickly. And so this is a question of how do we respond to these very different religious approaches. So I'm gonna give more from sort of an academic and a religious response. How do we respond to each of these? For the African-American anti-Semitism, I would say some education on both the religious and historical context. So going back to that old idea of sort of the identification of Exodus with the African-American experience, emphasizing how important this was, and looking at that as sort of a common bond that crosses the religious divide, but also is sort of a common bond and a common point of experience. I think that there's also something to be said for looking at the historical origins of racism. So if people are saying race is a social construct, and then they're trying to construct Jews in the privilege box, I think it might be worth reminding them that the first historical evidence we have of racism is actually from 14th century Spain, where there was this idea that Jews who were converting to Christianity, the conversion couldn't be trusted because there's somehow sort of a taint in the blood. An idea that later sort of transmogrifies to racial superiority and inferiority, as the Spanish are sort of expanding into new spheres with their colonialism. So Jews are in fact the first victims of racism, and I think that's really important as well. On the Fuentes side, I think the best antidote to Fuentes's white Christianity is actual American Christianity, and so there's a lot more engagement, I think, from those of us who are in the Christian side, who are more sympathetic to Jews, more sympathetic to Israel, and more sympathetic to the actual Christian gospel, to get out there and start really aggressively countering this stuff. And then I guess the other thing that I would say is it seems like racial polarization, particularly on campus, is going to be bad for anti-Semitism, because whether you're on the intersectional left or the alt-right, it seems like the one thing that you can all agree on is that whichever category you don't like is the category you put Jews in. So racial polarization, ironically enough, is leaving sort of the Jews stuck in the Jews and anti-Semitism somewhat stuck in the middle. And so if there's anything we can do to sort of counter that racial polarization, I would say that will probably, that would decrease some of the impetus for anti-Semitism, just because of the way it's being racialized right now. So those are kind of some of my initial thoughts.
Thank you so much, AJ. And actually, that's a really excellent endpoint to segue into the first question that we have. Is this faculty member is saying, you know, what are the academic antidotes to some of these twisted tropes that we see on campus? These ideas that are being promoted in intellectual and academic circles. How is it that a sizable number of academics are positively reinforcing anti-Semitic narratives that play into these tropes and promote extreme views on both the right and the left? What can those in academia do to counter what you're seeing?
Dr. Fishman, do you want to go first?
Yes, one of the problems is that on many campuses, anti-Semitism doesn't count as hate speech, racial hate speech. For some reason, because Jews aren't officially a race, although given that we understand the social construction of race, it's kind of a funny distinction. But as a group, Jews are not perceived as being in the same category as other groups who are defined by their, shall we say, ethnicity. And as a result, it isn't taught. Anti-Semitism is only taught about typically in courses that are specifically about anti-Semitism. One of the antidotes that I would suggest is that we call out, and that it becomes a norm to call out anti-Semitism whenever it's appropriate in whatever kind of course a person is teaching. It'll be hard in chemistry, but in a lot of the liberal arts, it certainly would be something that should be done that typically isn't done. And I'm going to give you an example from film studies. The early film of Showboat and then the film of South Pacific, especially Showboat, were actually banned in many Southern communities. And the reason that they were banned, they wouldn't let people see a film of Showboat because they believed that it was Jews in Hollywood trying to, and this is a quote, undermine Christian morality by showing and teaching miscegenation. Jews have been blamed in similar ways for promoting the LGBTQ agenda, as it would seem also in some very conservative environments. So I would say that if you're teaching novels or plays or films, and you know that that particular novel or play or film either contains anti-Semitic content or it was greeted with anti-Semitic responses, that should be included in the curriculum in the same way that a person would never teach Gone with the Wind, for example, without talking about specifically the racial stereotypes. So we need to try to get the teaching of anti-Semitism onto college campuses and into college curricula wherever it would be appropriate and illuminating in the curriculum. And I think it's really important for those of us who believe in this to do it, because there are many faculty members who are ideologically opposed to this and who believe in the anti-Semitism that's implicit in intersectionality and other ideas like that. It's very unfortunate because many of these ideas are actually very useful when they're not interwoven with anti-Semitism, but it's important for us to use our courses and to use the dialogue in the classroom to alert students to anti-Semitism or opportunities of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the other thing is, again, just my discipline is more focused on, the really hotspot of Israel, right? Israel studies. I've done a lot of teaching on that. I don't get a lot of the anti-Semitism actually here, because most of the people that are taking classes at Israel, on Israel at Regent are very pro. But it's certainly something that's in the water. And one of my favorite responses when people talk about how Israel is an apartheid state, I say, oh, that's interesting. Remind me of the time when the African National Congress and the Inkatha Freedom Party were in government with the parties that were pro-apartheid. Well, that never happened, but you did have a situation where one of the Arab parties was in government with some Zionist parties. So, there's some prima facie good evidence that the apartheid smear just doesn't hold water when you start looking at the facts of how things actually go. Now, obviously, we all have, everybody has different opinions about different figures and different actors in Israel, but some of those sort of categorical, I think, arguments that people make, which aren't really arguments, are pretty easy to knock down. The other thing about intersectionality, and I have having taught both intersectionality and Merchant of Venice in an honors class recently, one of the things that I tell my students is there's a difference between a paradigm and a tool. Intersectionality as a tool for looking at discrete instances of discrimination can actually be quite useful. Intersectionality as a paradigm means you have to try to fit everything into those intersectional categories. And so the reason why you might see anti-Semitism getting woven in is because if you're treating this in a paradigmatic way, then you have to find a way to fit Jews and the Jewish experience into one of these intersectional boxes. And it just doesn't neatly fit. And if you look at it as a tool for looking at specific instances of discrimination, that's okay. But if you're trying to do it paradigmatically, then you're going to default to some of these sort of post-colonial assumptions that Dr. Fishman talked about that are very problematic.
Thank you, AJ. And we have one comment that agrees with the idea of bringing anti-Semitism into curricula. And to that note, AEN is actually launching an initiative in a few weeks in which we'll make public a database of syllabi that AEN faculty members have taught in their academic careers that focus on anti-Semitism, so that people who might be interested in starting their own coursework on anti-Semitism have these resources to look at to kind of see the types of books and articles and other materials that they're using in these courses. So we'll be rolling out that initiative soon. It's called the Anti-Semitism Syllabi Bank, and we're very much looking forward to having that as a resource. So we have time for probably one more question if anybody wants to ask. And if not, then I want to thank our two presenters, Sylvia and AJ, for bringing your wealth of knowledge into very complex and intricate topics and helping illuminate a very, very difficult current situation. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And for the rest of you, I hope you attend our future webinars. There will be more coming up soon. So stay tuned for more information about those.